savaged his opponents, and set out his trenchant views on class conflict, the lessons of earlier revolutions, the dismantling of the bourgeois state, and the replacement of capitalism by the dictatorship of the proletariat. As both a historical document and a political statement, its importance can hardly be exaggerated. We are honored to have with us Mr. Varkai Parakal, an SFI activist and researcher pursuing MA in Labour and Development Studies from Ambedkar University, Delhi. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, comrades of the two study circles who invited me. I hope I'm audible and that there is no distortion in the audio that's coming through. Firstly, I would like to begin by saying that we can avoid with this whole sir business. You can just call me comrade. And I would prefer that over any other prefix. So yeah, as it was explained, this is a very significant document in the understanding of Marxism-Leninism, the understanding of what the state means to the workers in the theoretical framework and the application of Marxism-Leninism. Right. This document is very important for several reasons. One, because it is a continuation of a longer debate that was held first between Marx and Proudhon, Marx being the authoritarian one and Proudhon being the anarchist. Then later by Marx and Bakunin being the anarchist. And then later between Kautsky and Lenin, and then Lenin and the other political forces that were operating in Russia and across the world at that time. Right. So this text is important also for another reason, right? Which is that when we are taking this series, right? Earlier, Comrade Prabhu took a class, if I understand correctly. I haven't attended it, but on what is Marxism. And Comrade Nikhil started out this whole thing with a class on the Communist Manifesto, right? So there is a very important takeaway, which I'm sure Comrade Prabhu has explained, and I'm sure Comrade Nikhil has also explained, but which I would like to reiterate here at the risk of repeating certain ideas, which is through the studying of this text, we can also hope to understand and inculcate the way of Marxist dialectical thinking. Right. This is a way of looking at history, of looking at institutions, of looking at anything actually, and understanding the contradiction that exists inside any particular system. And this analysis, this kind of analysis, is more scientific and less moralistic, right? This is not a debate on whether the state is good or bad, because good and bad, when you phrase the question like that, it suddenly there is a bit of moralism that comes into the question. This is a look into what was the historical situation that led to the arising of the state, and what necessitated the continuation of the state's existence all this time. Whether those historical conditions are forever or are they bound to change, and when they change, whether this institution called the state, whether it will wither away, whether it has to be abolished, whether it will continue to exist. It's a look into all of these questions, right? So, to begin with, we have to first understand what we mean by when we say looking at something dialectically, and looking at something amorally in some sense, as in beyond the framework of, oh, this is good, this is bad, this we reject, this we take. Marxist analysis generally does not go into such moralisms. And what do we mean by that, right? Let's look at one example. When we look at the case of religion, right? 18th century philosophers, like 19th century philosophers, 18th century philosophers during Marx's time, there were skeptics, there were atheists, there were materialists of various sorts who looked at Christianity, who looked at religion, and said, okay, this does not make any sense, right? The scientific revolution has happened in Europe. Science is being able to explain far more things than, like, just God doing something. The religion thing is very conservative. It seeks to keep the old system in order and prevent the society from moving forward, progressing. And therefore, we should just deny religion. We should just do away with religion. And that approach is not what is taken by Marxists, right? Marxists also disagree with religion in the sense that Marx himself disagreed with what religion meant, what the specific task of religion is, etc., etc. But he also understood it in the context of why it exists, right? What helps religion survive? And according to him, it was the alienation that is caused by the oppression of economic system. The fact that peasants and workers go through very difficult, hard lives in which they need some solace, some release from the repression that they face from the system. That release they find in religion, right? So while criticizing religion, we also understand why it is necessary or what kind of historical conditions allow for its existence, right? And when we understand systems in that sense, we understand it further in terms of, if you don't want religion, how do we go about it? How do we, what is the first step forward? Do we just do a revolution today and tomorrow say, okay, all religion is abolished, that no one should go to church from tomorrow? Do we just say that? Will that work? These clearly, I mean, that won't work. I mean, no country on earth has abolished religion that way. It has never worked. And to understand why that doesn't work is basically the task of Marxist analysis. And in the same way, that this text of State and Revolution looks at the institution of the state, right? So this is also a part of the larger debate which is happening at that time, preceding Marx. Even there was Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, all who had different ideas of what is the state and what the state meant. The Marxists, including Marx and Engels himself, did not particularly subscribe to some of those definitions. And they thought those definitions did not really capture the essence of what is the state completely, right? For example, Marx himself was a Hegelian in a sense that he liked the works of philosopher Hegel, and he started out his works from the analysis of Hegel. But Hegel was a big statist in the sense that he actually called the state the march of God on earth, right? That religion has lost power, the institution of family has lost power, modernity is coming in, and state is the final authority. The state is what keeps the civilized world together. And without the state, the world will just break down and go into chaos, and people will just attack each other, and we loot stores and do whatever we want. Without the state, the repressive mechanisms of the state, the police and the army and the courts, without it, society will devolve into chaos. That was one understanding of what the state was. And although that is true in the sense that the repressive mechanisms of the state is one of the big aspects of the state, it does not really encompass the historical development of the state, and basically it did not it was not a complete analysis according to Marx, and we'll get into why it was not. Right. The other reason why this document is important to read is, as the comrade mentioned in the beginning, it was a certain movement in history in 1917, right before the October Revolution, when the Bolsheviks took power and the Russian Revolution came into fruition. There was a lot of debate among different kinds of socialists in Russia and in Europe at that point, as to, as socialists, what is our task, right? As socialists, how do we go about with this whole state business, right? Do we just take power and then tomorrow morning abolish the state, because state is a very repressive force, no one likes the state? Should we just do away with it, or do we wield it and use it for the benefit of the workers? There's a lot of debate as to, and if we wield it, what kind of state is it going to be, right? There was a lot of debate as to how this was all going to happen, and Lenin was in the center of all this debate as the leader of the Bolshevik Party, which several months after this document was written would take power and do the revolution in the Russian Empire and turn it into the Soviet Union. It was very important to address these questions and to correct what he called deviational tendencies among socialists, as what Lenin puts it. Right. So these are the conditions in Russia, right? And the reason why he writes this document, if you can read it in the first page itself, is that there seems to be an attempt at that time by the leader of the then disbanded Second International, Karl Kautsky, and other anarchists in Russia, as to what exactly Marx meant by the proletarian state, by the dictatorship of the proletariat, and all that. Right? And Lenin called all this a vulgarization of Marxism, and that there's a very clear line of thought that Marx is putting forward, and any deviation from that would be revisionism and vulgarization of Marx's ideas. Right. So it is directly attacking. If you read the book, you can see it's also, I mean, Marxists in general are very petty in how they argue, in the sense that Lenin attacks Kautsky, calls him a Philistine, a vulgarizer, an idiot, and all that. I mean, they're very full frontal in how they attack other people and their ideas. Right. So Lenin, in the opening page itself, starts by saying that there are attempts, after revolutionary thinkers die, there are attempts by the powers that be, by the ruling class, to make them into harmless icons. Right. We have a very present example of this. This is Che Guevara, right? Che Guevara was this big anti-capitalist that the America themselves, towards the end, killed, shot him in the Bolivian forest. But now the capitalist world has appropriated him as this harmless icon, put his image on a T-shirt. Now he's just the symbol of rebellion. And we forget socialism, communism, Marxism, all the ideas that he stood for, the anti-establishment, the anti-capitalist ideas that he stood for. So a similar thing was happening to Marx at that point, according to Lenin, that they were taking his ideas and making them harmless. And what were these ideas that were making they were trying to impose on Marx, that according to Lenin, Marx did not say, that would neutralize Marxist ideas, would make it harmless against the capitalist class, right? So to understand all this, we have to begin with the Marxist definition of the state. Very differently from the understanding of a lot of philosophers before, Marxists called the state a tool by which one class oppresses another. Right? It's a fairly straightforward definition. And how do we understand this? Right? When you look back into history, and to understand that, reading just The State and Revolution is not enough. There is a previous document, an earlier document by Engels, which looks into this subject, which is the origin of the family, the state, and private property, which is also a great read on the origin of the state apparatus as it exists today. If you look at human society across history, you see that the institution of the state is not some eternal thing that has always existed since history began, right? Since humans evolved out of monkeys, suddenly the state did not appear. Humans existed in tribal organizations, in clans, uh, which did not have in the modern definition of what we call a state, right? Marx himself called these systems anarcho-communism, in the sense that there is no state in that a tribe will not have a standing army, a tribe will not have prisons, a tribe will not have a judiciary that can condemn criminals to prisons. A tribe will not have a police, right? It was an internally regulating system that did not have these institutions, right? So when did these institutions start coming about? And as Marxists put it, or as Engels puts it in The Origin of the Family, the State and Private Property, the state as an institution does not begin from the beginning of mankind. It begins with the origin of private property, right? When farming started, and historically, if you look at it, this is primarily in the Indus Valley, the, the Mesopotamian Delta, and in the Nile, the Egyptian civilization. When large-scale farming started, and when they started producing surplus, right, more than enough food than what was necessary for a year's consumption of the whole population, that created a need to create private property. Who owns the land on which the crops are being produced, right? And on that question, we have the first conflicts and the first class society, right? And this is the feudal, the slave societies of the past, where landlords own the land and peasants work on the land. They don't own the land. They are given a share of what they produce. And the majority, the lion's share of what they produce, whatever grain or vegetable or whatever is produced, is taken by the landlord, right? And herein lies a contradiction, right? Some people do the work, and some people own the things that are required to do the work and to produce them. And this is, in the Marxist understanding, the first class societies, right? And this class societies produces certain irreconcilable contradictions. People who work on the land obviously want more of what they produce because they produced it anyway. There are these group of people who because their grandfather owned the land and the grandfather's grandfathers owned the land, claim that all these acres of land is mine, and therefore you work under it, and whatever you produce from it belongs to me. And the landlords have an interest of getting more and more surplus from what is being produced on the land, squeeze the peasants a little more every year to get what is being produced, right? And this is a contradiction, and this has resulted in violent uprisings throughout history, in Egypt, in Rome, everywhere. If you look at ancient class societies, there has always been friction because of the contradiction of interests between the peasant class and the landlord class, the slave class and the landlord class. And according to Engels, the state comes into being to reconcile this contradiction. Because according to him, without a mediator, without something to mediate this contradiction, society is just going to break down in war and people fighting each other, and it's going to be meaningless. So state is not something that is natural to humans, that has always existed, that will always exist. It is the product of certain historical conditions, and these historical conditions is private property, the differentiation of human beings into different classes, and the contradiction between those classes. And the Marxist argument is that as long as these contradictions continue to exist, there is always a necessity for the existence of a state, right? So this is basically the definition of the Marxist definition of state. Of course, Engels and Lenin and Marx and all of them go into greater detail. I can, in the end, suggest a lot of readings that you can go through, which are not dense, difficult readings. They're fairly simple, straightforward writing, which is one of the useful things about Marxists, that the writings are generally much more legible than the later 20th century philosophers, right? So in that, when we go into the text itself, it begins with this understanding of what does it mean when we say that the state is this reconciliatory force between two opposing classes. Some people have interpreted this as being said that, oh, state is something that stands outside society, and in society there are two classes of people that fight each other, and then they try to mediate it with the police and the repressive forces that the state has. It makes sure that things don't go out of hand, right? But that is not exactly what Marx means in his definition. When he says that it's a force of reconciliation, it's also a force of reconciliation with a certain bias towards one class, because that class owned the means of production, the land on which you do the production, the trees that you have to cut down to make firewood, the grain that you have to you have to plant every year, the seeds that you have to plant every year, these are owned by certain individuals, right? So those individuals obviously gain power and they form the state. And in capitalism, Marx called it the bourgeois state. In feudalism, it's the feudal state, right? In India, it was the state based on caste, the Kshatriyas, the Brahmins, the Baniyas, the different castes that had some or the other relation to production, control the state mechanism, right? In Rome, it was the slave owners. The slave owners came together and made the Republic of Rome. Clearly, the reconciliation did not mean that the slaves had any say in what the state can do, or the Dalits in India had any say in what the state can do, or in now under capitalism, the workers, how much say they have in what the state can do in a bourgeois democracy, right? So it's a reconciliatory force, but it is in the interest of a certain class of people, and that is the class that owns things, right? So it is particularly not in favor of the workers. And if these states have given any concessions to the workers or to the peasants or to the slaves in the past, it has not been because they were controlled by great people with big hearts who looked at workers and thought, oh, maybe they could get higher wages. It was not because of that. It was because workers got tired, and then suddenly some riots happened, people protested, burned down some buildings, and that forced the state to give some concession, so that the state does not, the society does not break down. Some concession to the workers, and which can also be taken back by the state whenever they feel like it, right? So when we say state is a body that reconciles the contradiction between classes, we don't mean that it does not have any class interest. It has very definite class interest, right? So here comes the other important question, right? Marx and Engels define the state as a body which is not outside society, that it takes form from within society due to certain historical conditions, but attempts to stand outside society, alienating itself further and further from society, so that it can use repressive force as and when needed, right? In a small local, in a small tribe, right, control of various things is more localized. You probably know the tribal chief. It's a more personal way of control, right? But you don't have, as a citizen in India, you don't really have much in terms of a personal relationship with the state, right? You go to a government office, these are the most impersonal people you'll ever meet. The police is not particularly friendly, neither is the army. And their point is that their task is not to be friendly with you. It is to be as alienated from you as possible, so that if tomorrow you protest in Jantar Mantar and the police wants to do a lathi charge, they can do it. They can do it indiscriminately, because it's an alienated force that can carry out such repression. And that is the task of the state. So what does it mean then when workers carry out a revolution as they had in the Soviet Union? What do they do with this whole thing of the state, right? since Marx has already mentioned that the state is a bad thing, that it's a historical, it is constituted historically, and that it will wither away when the historical necessity is gone. When is this historical necessity gone? Right, that is the other important question. Do we today carry out a revolution? What do we do when we carry out a revolution? What did the Soviets do when they carry out a revolution? The workers take hold of state power. Everything that is owned privately by capitalists is nationalized, and therefore there are no capitalists from tomorrow. So there is no class society tomorrow, and therefore there's no class contradiction, and therefore you can abolish the state. Right? Makes certain logical sense when you think about it that way. But then clearly that was not the case, right? And this is an important point on which he debates with Kautsky, in the sense that the withering away of the state, as Marx called it, when the historical conditions change and it does not necessitate the existence of the state, the withering away that happens is not exactly a peaceful process, right? There are two stages to this. The first stage, according to Lenin, is when the workers in a capitalist state do a revolution with the help of a vanguard party and so on. That's a different debate with Lenin. And take state power, right? They storm the parliament, storm the palace, and they take state power. From the bourgeois controlling the state, we have now the workers controlling the state. And then what should the workers do with it, right? So Lenin's argument is that just because workers now control the state and the means of production, which were earlier owned by the capitalists, is now nationalized, suddenly it does not abolish all kind of class relations in a country. And what does he mean by that? So you do a revolution in the Soviet Union. You're only doing a revolution in the Soviet Union, right? There are still capitalists outside the Soviet Union. There are still states outside the Soviet Union which might not want the Soviet Union to exist. And as Marx puts it, the new society, the socialist society after a revolution, will bear the birthmarks of the old society, right? There will be still people in after the revolution who still want to accumulate capital and become capitalists. There will still be people who want to restore the old system, and they will try to do all sort of weird things from inside. And the workers' revolution needs to protect itself against that as well, right? So his argument is that, and this is what Marx finally means when he says the dictatorship of the proletariat. When the proletariat, when the working people finally do a revolution, the task is not to abolish the state the very next day, but to create the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? The dictatorship of the proletariat will have some of the characteristics of the old bourgeois state, in that it will have a police, it will be centralized to some extent, it will have a standing army, it will have intelligence services that spy on people, it will have all the repressive mechanisms that Marxists are generally against. And it will have all these things because the historical conditions by which we can dispel these mechanisms have not ceased to exist. And this was very clear after the Soviet Revolution. It's not mentioned in the book because this book was written before the Russian Civil War. But what we can see is that the revolution of 1917 happened, and then the Soviet Union plunged into 6 years of civil war against the Red and the White armies, right? The Red armies were the army that was developed by the Bolsheviks prior to the revolution. It was a voluntary group, not really particularly trained and all that. It had people from the army joining because of sympathy and all that. But the White Army was this huge trained imperialist force, which the US and all backed in 1917, just attacking the country from within. The Soviet Civil War lasted for 6 years. Millions of people died. So if the workers had taken control of the Soviets and dismissed the army because it's a repressive mechanism, they could not have protected the revolution against the civil war that was going to come. And therefore, and this is the Marxist understanding that is beyond sort of good and evil that I'm talking about, that despite the repressive nature of certain mechanisms, we don't do away with it one morning because it's repressive. Because unless we change the historical condition that led to its creation, we cannot do away with it. And for the workers, according to Lenin, uh, the task is to smash the bourgeois state, come up with their own state. But this new state will also have marked characteristics of the old state. And these things will wither away. And that is the other important point, right? In the 18th Brumaire, Marx says that previous revolutions, this includes the first French Revolution, the second French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution that happened in Haiti, which was 1879, one of the important revolutions. Or any, you look at any revolution, it disrupts the existing system, the establishment. The establishment is thrown into disarray. And the revolutionaries perfect how to run the state, right? They perfect how to run the state, and that itself is what leads to the downfall of these revolutions, according to Marx. And according to him, the whole point is for the state to wither away. And this is an important distinction between Marxists and social democrats, between Marxists and other kind of socialists, that which is more in common with between Marxists and anarchists, which is that in the short run we are statists, in that we argue that a worker state is necessary to protect the revolution from all kinds of disturbances from inside and outside, war and so on. But in the long run, we are anti-statists. We believe that the state is this thing for repression, and therefore it should be abolished, right? And here they take the example, they learn from the example of the Paris Commune. Comrade Nikhil might have reference to this in the talk that he gave on the Communist Manifesto earlier. But in the revised edition of the manifesto, when it was published after the Paris Commune, in the preface, Engels and Marx say that some of the points that we have raised in the manifesto earlier have now become out of date, because the Paris Commune happened, workers took power for a couple of months, and then it collapsed. So why did it collapse? What led to the collapse of the Commune? And what do we learn from that as socialists? What do we learn from that as in practicing scientific socialism? When we do another revolution, how do we keep from committing the same mistakes? Right? And here I think one quote from Engels is important. And this is from Anti-Düring, if I remember correctly. And he says, would the Paris Commune have lasted more than a day if it had not used the authority of the armed people against the bourgeoisie? Cannot we, on the contrary, blame it for having made too little use of that authority? Therefore, one of two things. Either that anti-authoritarians don't know what they're talking about, in which case they are creating nothing but confusion, or they do know, in that case they are betraying the cause of the proletariat. So here he makes it very clear that what led to the downfall of the Paris Commune is the fact that they did not use the repressive mechanisms of the state hard enough, in the sense that they were not repressive enough in the reactionary uprising that followed the Paris Commune, which eventually led to its downfall, right? It's a very authoritarian thing to say, but it makes sense in the certain context, in the sense that the anti-authoritarians he's referring to here are anarchists who believe that we should do a revolution and disband the state the next morning. This will not work, because our task is simply not just to do a revolution, but it is also to protect the revolution from the reactionaries that want to destroy the attempts of the achievements of the revolution. And when we go to part 3 of the book, it also goes into another important point, right? And that important point is, what will the new worker state look like? Lenin has already said that it will bear the markings of the old state, right? That it will have a lot of similarities with the old bourgeois state. Just the difference is that now workers control the state. The means of production is owned by the state. Capitalists don't exist within the country and so on. But it will also be different in the sense that it is a worker state, and that change also necessitates certain other changes to how the state functions, right? And in that, one of the important things that he makes is the smashing of parliamentarism, right? He says that how does the bourgeois state operate? There is the bourgeois democracy, the liberal democracy, such as the one we are living in right now, where we elect people every 5 years who comes to power. They pass certain laws. They go out of power. Different people come to power after that. But who actually enforces a lot of the actual state's work? The executive, the IAS officers, the government officials, the clerks in a government office. These people are not accounted for electorally. They write exams and then they get into these posts. And for for Lenin, he says that very clearly. This is a way by which the state disguises its actual work of protecting private property for the capitalists and so on. Because no matter who comes to power in the parliament, we ensure that this work continues through the non-accountable, almost non-accountable executive that we have in power, right? And according to him, the abolition of the bureaucracy of the official, the status of this almost holy status of this bureaucratic officials who have life and death control over the lives of people. They have to be held more, be made more accountable. They have to be elected. They have to be held responsible for their actions, and that there cannot be the marked difference between the legislative and the executive as it exists in the capitalist democracy. And this is sort of how the Soviet Union functioned as well post the revolution. I mean, they did not just argue these things; they made sure that some of these things are followed. Although the conditions later changed, the World War II happened, and all that, the essence of the document still stays, and it guided the Soviet Union until its collapse in 1991. Right. And there's also another important point that we have to look at it in the book. In the book has two parts, right? It is the state and revolution, right? And in the part about revolution, it's basically about how to carry out revolution and how to hold state power and all that. And in that, he makes a significant. It's just one line, but I think it's significant, right? He says that anarchists and other kinds of socialists want to change the people, like as in the large mass of the people. And when the people change and when they understand that, okay, this system is bad and it's exploiting us and whatever, the mass of the people will come forward and do the revolution by spontaneous uprising and all that. And although spontaneous uprisings have happened in the past, Lenin thinks that it's not a really effective way of doing revolutions. He argues that there requires a vanguard from the working class, and that vanguard will be the party, the Marxist party, which come from the workers, but are people who work among the masses in organizing the masses, who understand theory, who can analyze the situation as it happens, and do the revolution with people as they are now. Right? What does that mean? There will be religious people now who don't really want socialists to come and abolish religion. Engels also argues against the institution of the family in the origin of the state, family, and private property. Obviously, after the revolution, we can't just abolish family overnight because it's an institution that has been entrenched over thousands of years. So we do the revolution with people as they exist now, right? We do revolutionary work, despite the fact that, let's say in India, if you're planning to do revolutionary work, you might go to a factory and then you'll suddenly realize that a lot of the workers are patriarchal. They use politically incorrect swear words, and they some of them get drunk and beat their wives and all that. So do we just cancel these workers, or do we just wait for the workers to reach a sufficient level of political literacy until we do the revolution? No, that's the opposite of what Lenin says. Lenin says that we have to do the revolution with people as they are. We try to bring as many people together as possible, based on the common minimum on which you can bring them together. and the vanguard party will bring them together and then carry out revolution on them. That is the task that he is talking about. So these are the important points in the text, and these are, I've covered basically the arguments that Lenin has placed from chapter 1, 2, and 3. And these are the crux of the arguments. Chapter 4, 5, and 6 are later elaborating on some of his arguments by quoting from Marx and Engels and other letters from Marx and all that again and again. It gets a little repetitive, but it's also important to read. But the important arguments come in the first 3 chapters, and that is what I have summarized here in the last 45 minutes. So we've understood the basics now. I think those who have listened, we can end my part for now, and we can get into the important bit of asking doubts. So yeah. Comrades, if any of you have doubts, now would be the time to ask.
Thank you so much, sir. It was indeed an insightful Thank you so much, comrade. It was indeed an insightful lecture. And I believe all comrades here would go back today with a clear understanding of the text. The participants now may post their questions, interjections, comments in the chat box. They may also speak it up if they feel like. The floor is now open for questions. Thank you.
Yeah, some of the questions are coming. Let me just figure out how to open this chat. Oh, yeah.
So you just a clarification. So you're directly addressing them through the chat box. So do you want me to read them out for you?
I can read them out and address them. It's not
okay. Perfect. Thank you.
Complicated. So cynical care is asking, in the Indian context, how are we going to unite people as they are when we are clearly divided by caste? Very important question. And this is a very important question that Marxists have grappled with since the movement started. Right. There was a lot of debate because India did not have a particularly large working class. Right. Even today, although the service sector and industry make up the majority of what is produced, they only still by population they have not overtaken the number of people who work in agriculture, who are the peasantry, right? And industrial workers, service sector workers have very different characteristics as opposed to the peasantry. And this is the case with most countries on earth. And in India, this is accentuated by the fact that all of these works are divided into castes. And one caste doesn't like the other caste, one thinks it's better than the other, and so on and so forth. How do you unite all these people together, right? That is the difficult task that the Marxists in India were faced with, which they had succeeded to some extent in different parts of India, which they did not succeed in different parts of India due to different reasons. This goes into a very important question, which is addressed, I think, by Comrade B.T. Ranadev and Comrade E.M.S. Namboodiripad in the 70s. When the Communist Party was convening at that point, on the question of caste. How do we address caste? How do we deal with it? How do we go about it as a Communist Party? Right. There they say that the struggle against caste, there was a belief until that point, at least informally among Marxists, that like how revolutions happened in Europe and feudalism was overturned and capitalism took its place, and how feudal relations were abolished and peasants became workers through primitive accumulation and so on. The revolution will happen in India. Maybe not a violent revolution as it had happened in Europe, but since the British rule was bringing in capitalism and bringing in industry into India, that since the caste was initially a feudal relation, that it will dismantle caste relations, and that capitalism will come and dismantle caste relations, so that we don't have to fight it directly. We just have to wait for capitalism to sort of break caste relations in India. And clearly, that is not what happened. That Marxists were clearly wrong in that analysis, in the sense that caste still continues despite people being workers. Now we have workers of different castes. We have an IT company in Microsoft. There will be a Brahmin engineer and there will be a Dalit engineer, and there will be discrimination inside Microsoft as well. So it did not go away as we expected. So how do we bring them together? That is an important question. Right? We bring them together by bringing to highlight or raising the concern that is common to all of them. Right? There will be various differences between different castes, but there will also be uniting factors. Right? So let's look at an example of my state, the state that I come from. I come from Kerala, right? And tillers are not one caste. There are people who work on coconut trees. There are people who plant paddy. They are different castes. They all belong to different castes. Some of them feel that they're higher, they're better than the other caste and all that. But none of them own land. The land is owned by the landlord classes, which were primarily Nayars and Brahmins and Syrian Christians, and some landlord Muslims in Malabar, right? But the landlord class always constitutes the minority. So if you raise this concern, land reform, it will, if you raise it effectively enough, if your party organization is strong enough that it can permeate to people, it will bring together, despite the differences between people, it will bring people together because they themselves have something to gain by standing with the movement. Some land to cultivate, their own land to make a house. And it is with these sort of demands that we can bring people together. And while we bring people together, we also have to carry on the legacy of the anti-caste struggle that was initiated to a large extent by Ambedkar and then other reformers in India in that time, and then carried over by the communist parties. We have to do that. So it's a struggle in two places, right? The struggle to organize the toiling masses who don't own anything against the people who own everything, to bring them together for their benefit. And it's also a struggle within that people we are organizing against the caste differences and the discrimination and the other oppression that exists within these toiling masses. So it's a struggle in two places that we have to do. At least that's what I think of it. So that is the Indian context. Could you enlighten us on, Himanshu Chaudhary is asking, could you enlighten us on the Ambedkar stand for Marx? I'm guessing on Marx. I mean, let's make it clear. Ambedkar was a great man, had made great insights into the origins and the functioning of caste in India. And he was a great reformer and a revolutionary in his own terms. But he was also a liberal. He was also a textbook liberal in the European sense. He studied in Oxford. He studied with the Fabians, who believed in a certain kind of socialism that did not require a revolution and so on. And due to these reasons and due to other reasons domestically, he was not in favor of the Marxist understanding or the idea that the people in power are not going to voluntarily just give up the power that they have. And that workers will have to fight for it and sometimes even violently uproot the power. He was not in favor of those ideas. He preferred the Fabian approach that we will do liberal democracy since there is universal franchise. Workers have some power, and with that power they can gain more things and so on, which is clearly not what is happening in India. If anything, what we've seen in the pandemic is that workers have lost anything that they've gained in the last 100 years. The 8-hour workday, the 7-day work week, basic labor laws have been stripped during the lockdown. So clearly, this liberal democratic idea of or liberal democratic dream, or the Fabian dream of Ambedkar against Marxism, did not really come into fruition. And this we have to look at him dialectically. While understanding his important contributions in understanding in society, you also have to critique him in this sort of very narrow understanding of Marxism. My opinion. Abhimanyu is asking, can you name some further readings on that? Yeah, I will do that in the end. If we have a bureaucracy in worker state, just like it existed in USSR, so isn't there a threat that capitalism will get restored? Uh, there is always a threat of capitalist restoration wherever you do a revolution, right? Because unless every country on earth simultaneously does revolution, which is not going to happen, and at least by the current political situation, it's not going to happen. There will always be countries that do revolution. Let's say Cuba has done revolution, and it's surrounded by capitalist countries. And these capitalist countries don't want Cuba to be socialist. They want the capitalist class to be restored there, right? Because otherwise, how do you extract resources from these third world countries for the profit of America? Because Cuban government is clearly not allowing them. So the threat of capitalist restoration primarily comes from capitalist encirclement, not from the workers' bureaucracy itself, right? The workers' bureaucracy, there are different dangers of having a bureaucracy in a workers' state. The bureaucracy can always gain too much power. They can be corrupt. Obviously, if you're giving someone, I write the IAS exam and I become the whatever IAS equivalent officer in after the Indian Revolution or whatever, and I'm given the right. You come to me. You come to me because you want a grant to study for your PhD. And well, if I have the power that my signature is going to make or break this grant, whether you'll get this grant or not is decided by my signature. That is the kind of power that bureaucracy has. There is always a chance of corruption. That is always there. And therefore, that is why Lenin talks about smashing the bureaucracy eventually. But the bureaucracy also serves a very specific purpose. And that purpose cannot be ignored. We cannot close our eyes and say it's dark, right? That purpose exists as long as these contradictions exist. So I guess that would be one way of looking at it. And regarding further readings on the topic, as I mentioned earlier, The Origin of the State, Family and Private Property is an important reading. It's also another small text. It's 70, 80 pages. Then Critique of the Gotha Program by Marx and Engels, and also the 18th Brumaire. The 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon is basically another important text on this thing. If you go through these, there will be some good insight into the Marxist understanding. And later you can read, when you get more, when you get time to read, you can also look into Althusser and Gramsci and state and hegemony and the repressive state apparatus and all these other later developments in European Marxist thought. You can go into that as well. It will give you some good insight into that.
Yeah. One more question is there.
Yes, come on.
One more question is there in the chat box.
Oh, okay. Oh, sorry. Ambedkar in his book, Buddha or Karl Marx asks two questions. When will basically the dictatorship of the proletariat wither away? But more importantly to him is what it will wither away. If withers away to anarchy, how will revolution survive? What will be the moral state of that society? So this raises two important questions. Buddha and Karl Marx, I've read parts of it long ago, so I don't remember the exact arguments. But in these arguments, when it will wither away, it is very clearly mentioned by Stalin in a later. I can send you the quote in the WhatsApp group if possible. Says that as long as there is capitalist encirclement, as long as the people who there are states outside your country, you do a socialist revolution in Delhi tomorrow, right? Delhi tomorrow is a socialist state. You declare revolution and it's a dictatorship of the proletariat in Delhi from tomorrow onwards. But UP is still capitalist, Haryana is still capitalist, Punjab is still capitalist. And none of these people want Delhi to remain socialist because it's not in the interest of their capitalist class. And as long as that capitalist encirclement is there, in the case of Delhi, it would be a literal encirclement. There cannot be a withering away of the state. And that the withering away of the state can only happen when the capitalist encirclement is replaced by socialist encirclement, when there can be cooperation between nations and not imperialist aggression and war. Until that contradiction goes away, there cannot be withering away. And what will be the moral state of society and all that? See, morality is not really enforced doesn't really have to be enforced by the state. That is an ahistorical understanding of Ambedkar on morality. There are existing tribal societies with without states in the sense of the state we described now, right? They have different types of other types of control, ways of controlling the members of the tribe. But it's not like they are without morality. They don't randomly go and kill a baby or something like that, right? They still have morality. This is a very wrong understanding that morality is something that originates from the state and that the state has to enforce it through the police. Otherwise, without the police, people will just kill each other and eat babies or whatever. That is an ahistorical understanding in my opinion. Because morality has existed before the state, it will continue existing after the state. The different other question. And there's one more question. According to you, anarchy is an ideology that can have material presence in our systems or complex. Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, the original debate was between Marx and the anarchists, between Marx and Proudhon, the father of anarchism, and then later Marx and Bakunin, the student of Proudhon and one of the important anarchists at that time. For them, they consider themselves anti-authoritarian, state is authority is bad, and therefore we should just dismantle the state right away after we do the revolution. Marxists and anarchists agree on certain points. We agree that capitalism is bad and that workers should be exploited and all that, and that we should do a violent revolution to basically dismiss this thing. But we disagree on the point that the state can be dismissed on the evening after the revolution, because that's the points I've mentioned earlier. And therefore, since the world is more complex than what the anarchists analyze it to be, we cannot dismiss of the state as and when we please. Unless we abolish the material conditions, again, I'm repeating myself at this point, unless we abolish the material conditions that lead to the arising of the state, we cannot abolish the state. It's that simple. How the modern nation states are undermining the communism as a practice and ideology in contemporary global politics. This is again a moral, sort of a moralistic question. It's a loaded question in the sense that what do we mean by undermining communism as a practice and ideology? Right? Communism's task is not to look at, let's say, the modern nation state and then say that, oh, okay, this is bad and it's undermining us and all that. The task of communism is to adapt to whatever changing conditions. Our task is not to sit back and complain that, oh, I go to my class for SFI work and I try to organize my classmates, but none of them are politically conscious and therefore I will not work in my class. That's not our task. Our task is not to sit back and complain. Our task is to understand, okay, why are our classmates not politically conscious, and what do I do about it? How do I change my approach in a way that I am listened to and that they understand what I'm saying and that they act on it? In the same way, nation states also, it's not a question that existed that much in the time of Marx and Engels, but it came very prominently during the time of Lenin and Stalin, because when they were carrying out the Russian Revolution, they had a very big problem, right? The Russians that make up the majority of the Russian Empire were an imperialist population. The Russian Empire was an imperialist empire that had colonies. Georgia, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, all these other countries that exist now were colonies under the Russian Empire. And when they carry out the revolution, the communists had a great incentive to keep all these colonies together. But this important question came: why would the colonists trust the communists? Because the revolution happened in Russia. Georgia and Tajikistan had very little to do with the revolution that happened in Russia. And Russia, until yesterday, was oppressing us. So from tomorrow, if it becomes communist, why should we stay with them? Right? So in this text also, he mentions the right of nations, of national unity and all that. But an important text about nation state and undermining communism and all that, I think you should read. And this is where he elucidates the right to self-determination as a fundamental right that we have to give under socialism. Is Stalin's nationalism and the Marxist question. I mean, Marxism and the national question. Sorry. This sort of goes off topic, so I won't get into it that much. But yeah, guess so that sort of answers the question, I guess. Private property that gives motivation to produce, at the same time, the differences. Private property gives the motivation to produce. It's not private property that gives the motivation to produce. The motivation to produce is there because, as you know, Marx explains, humans are not really good at surviving in nature as it is. Like we are not like a tiger that if you put in a forest, it has to hunt a deer once in a while, but otherwise it can just sleep wherever it wants. It can give birth wherever it wants, and so on. Humans have evolutionarily become very incapable of that. That if we are put in a forest, if a group of us, the people in this class, are tomorrow put in a forest, for us to survive, we need to modify the forest to build shelter and etc., etc. And that is the primary motivation to produce. The fact that we need human labor to change the environment to meet our needs, which in that sense we are very different from the vast majority of animals in the amount of need we have to change our environment. And that is the primary motivation to produce. Private property is what creates differences. It's not what ends up causing the need to produce. Tribal societies also produce. They produce pottery, they produce food, they produce a lot of things. They produce clothing of various sorts, they produce huts. That's also production. They don't have private property. Yeah, I guess that answers some of the questions. I think it is somewhat gone beyond the time. It's 7:09 now, and I think half the people who are attending has left. So by this, I think we would have to end it. Himanshu has asked a question. You can text it to me. I'll respond it to you on WhatsApp. My number, you can find it on the Blood and Circle group itself. I'm there on the WhatsApp. So yeah, I guess that's it.
Thank you so much for joining and asking such thought-provoking questions, comrades. Bread and Roses Study Circle LSR and Ambedkar Study Circle regularly host reading sessions, lectures, and webinars on the various aspects of communism, socialism, Marxist ideology, feminism, caste, class, so on and so forth. We really look forward to your participation in the upcoming sessions. I have attached the links of the WhatsApp groups and the Instagram pages of the two study circles in the chat box. We'd love to welcome you. Last but definitely not the least, thank you so much, Comrade Varkai Parakal, for sparing your valuable time, explaining the text so wonderfully, and answering the questions so patiently. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, comrades, for inviting me. I hope we'll see each other again soon.
Yes, sir, absolutely.
Okay.
Comrade, sorry.